Hello all, this is Amira Armond from Curie Solutions. We have Mark Hapeman, and we're continuing our CMMC scoping for level 2 after the final rule discussion. And we think this is part 5 now. Yep. So we're talking about contractor risk managed assets. We're just going down the scoping guide and giving you information. So Contractor Risk Managed Assets, CRMA for short. These are defined as assets that can, but are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI because you have security policy, procedures, or practices in place. And when I read practices, I add in like technical stuff, right? Data loss protection, you've got some other thing trying to prevent it, right? Permissions, for example, okay? They are not required to be physically or logically separated from CUI assets. So this is a pretty important point because what this means is the DoD, and you can see commentary to this effect in the final rule. The DoD says basically, if you have something on the same network as CUI, if it's inside the same boundary as CUI, then it has to be in scope. And we feel that anything that's inside that network that has the ability to communicate laterally, we feel that these devices, since they can talk to a CUI asset, they need to be secure. And they're potentially accessing the CUI just because they're right there, right? You don't have a big firewall in between. They can do a port scan against that other device. Maybe they can open up a file share to the other device, right? You know, back in the olden days, I don't know if any network admins used to do this, right? But you know, it would be a pure name, right? You remember that guy? So that's the hidden share for the C drive. And in Windows networks, if you log in as an admin to a computer, anywhere inside the network, you could just type in some other computer name and get access to their C drive or their D drive, right? And do anything you want.
Pretty handy for IT consulting.
It's nice if you're a sysadmin or an MSP. So anyways, the DoD understands this. They know that this is a possibility, right? They know that bad guys very commonly will attack a weak point and then use that weak point to attack other stuff. Okay? So they are basically saying that if you've got other assets next to CUI, they are considered contractor risk managed assets. Now, the way that you make it not a contractor risk managed asset is you put it on the other side of a strong boundary. You see how there's a big firewall in between, right? So if this firewall blocks all traffic by default, strongly controls communications, then we can say stuff on the other side of it is not logically connected to CUI in this example. Or maybe you've got some users wandering around, and over here, this side is a secure manufacturing area, right? And this side over here is just the corporate building. So if this accountant can wander over to the secure manufacturing area and just look around whenever they want to, you know, pick up some diagrams and browse through them, well, they are not logically separated from CUI. Right? But if you keep them over here in a corporate area, they might be, they would probably be out of scope. I would generally consider these guys to be out of scope if they can't just walk into the other building. Okay. But you can have situations where this accountant is not supposed to go in the manufacturing area. They're told to, they have a policy, whatever, right? But they do have the ability because they work for the company. And that's a cheap example of a contractor risk managed asset where, you've told this accountant, don't go over there, or if you go over there, don't look at the CUI. And that's a policy, procedure, or practice that's preventing them from getting to the CUI. So, contractor risk managed assets. They have the exact same organization seeking assessment requirements as the rest of this stuff, CUI, security protection assets. So you need to talk about, you have to track them in your asset inventory. You need to know who has potentially access to CUI, right? What devices are on the same network as CUI? And this can get very detailed, right? You could point out that this printer, even if it's not supposed to have CUI on it, just because it's on the network, needs to be inventory. Or any other devices in the network. So this still does require pretty active asset inventory and asset control. You need to talk about how you're doing all the requirements to protect these contractor risk managed assets. You need to show it in the network diagram, and then you need to prepare to be assessed against CMMC Level 2 security requirements. Oh my goodness. I thought that we didn't have to secure CRMA. Back before the final rule came out, generally most assessors were kind of like, CRMA don't need to be secured. Okay. And I know lots of companies that followed that philosophy of, they're not supposed to deal with CUI, so we don't have to do anything. We don't have to have firewalls, no antivirus. We don't have to patch them, vulnerability scan, nothing.
So it's that can, assets that can.
Yeah. What happened in the final rule is the DoD clarified, right? So they made the language exactly the same for how you need to prepare. And then in the commentary, they said, look, because these assets have access to CUI, because they are on the same network as CUI, because they can open a link to that CUI asset, that file server, that workstation, whatever. We actually, the DoD says we actually consider these things to be CUI assets, but we're going to be kind to the defense contractors and we're going to not assess them. So the DoD basically said, we told you, with 800-171, the DFARS 7012 clause, we said secure your network. We said apply all the requirements to your network. And in the DoD's mind, that meant even stuff that's not supposed to deal with CUI, they wanted you to do patching and vulnerability scanning and network communications and all that stuff, right?
Good hygiene.
Good hygiene, apply the protections across your entire CUI network. But in the CMMC rule, the DoD is making the argument that this CMMC rule doesn't change any of the underlying requirements for how you need to protect CUI, right? What they say is all it does is it adds that third-party assessment requirement. It adds self-assessment requirements. That's it. CMMC doesn't force you to do security. We've been telling you to do security since 2017. CMMC just makes you assess it, and that's it. So when we get to this category, the DoD says we're going to be nice to the contractors by saying you don't need to assess CRMAs as much as the other stuff, the CUI assets, the security protection assets, right? Because again, for the DoD's perspective, CMMC is just the assessment portion. So they don't change the requirement for securing it, because that's been there for a while, according to the DoD. They're saying, give them a break on the assessment, right? We're being kind to the contractors. Okay, so what does the assessor need to do? The assessor is supposed to review the system security plan and see whether the CRMAs on the network are secure according to that self-attested documentation, the SSP, right? So if we as an assessor, we see that you've got complex passwords turned on for your CRMA, you're doing vulnerability scanning for the CRMA, you've got an account lockout threshold for the CRMA, right? All the requirements, just like your CUI assets, we're just going to go, cool, right? It appears that you're doing all this stuff, and we're just going to read the SSP and we're good.
So we're not going to go confirm.
Not if it's well documented.
Yeah.
Not if it's sufficiently documented. And when we talk about sufficiently documented, again, I'm trying to make the distinction between talking about the asset in generalities versus saying how we do each requirement on that asset type.
Yeah.
Right. If it's a requirement that can be applied to that asset type, right? If it's screen lock, for example, the screen has to lock after 15 minutes, for example. Well, we're not expecting that to be applied to a person. We're expecting it to be applied to a workstation, right? So if it's a requirement that can be applied to the workstation, even if it's a CRMA, we want to see how that requirement is applied. Documentation in the SSP. And if the documentation is good, saying, this is how I do the screen lock, this is how I do the vulnerability scan, this is how I patch it, we're just going to go, awesome, no further questions, keep on going. But there is instructions to the assessor about conducting a limited check to identify deficiencies. Now, in previous versions of the scoping guide, it was really unclear what the DoD wanted from the assessor. But it basically said you can conduct a check to identify risks, and we didn't know what identify risks meant, right? They have since clarified it, and now it's pretty clear that the spot checks are for individual requirements against that CRMA. So if we're reading how you're doing malware protection, and you talk about your CUI assets, and you say the way we do it is by this antivirus, and this other type of CUI asset, we do it this way, and then we get to your CRMA, and you don't talk about anything. You just don't even mention the CRMA at all for how you're doing malware protection. As an assessor, this is saying, go find out if they're doing malware protection. So if you don't want any questions from the assessor, if you don't want a spot check, then talk to how you're doing every requirement for your CRMA, just like you talk about how you're doing each requirement for your CUI assets.
So details can really matter.
That's what the DoD is telling us in the scoping guide.
Yeah.
Yep. And again, they will be assessed against individual security requirements. Now, what happens if that exact scenario? Okay, so screen lock, right? So is your computer locking a screen after inactivity. We see you describe it for CUI assets, but we see nothing for your CRMA. We are supposed to do a spot check. Hey, how are you doing screen locks? If the organization doesn't have it set up, then what we would be doing is we would actually be marking the screen lock requirement not met.
I was going to ask you that question, like how this impacts meeting or not meeting certain requirements.
Yep. So it's not a deficiency that just kind of evaporates into the world. It would affect the entire assessment as a whole by reducing your point score and potentially being a non-mitigatable item, right? Where you can't get a certification. Okay. But good news is, as long as you're sufficiently documenting how you're doing the requirements, the assessor should not have any questions, right? Just make sure you talk about how you're doing each of the requirements for your CRMA assets. All right, so let's look at this little diagram here. So what would be CRMA in this diagram? Well, it definitely can't be this engineer because they're meant to store, process, or transmit CUI. It definitely can't be this engineer's laptop because, again, it's meant to, right? You need to do that. It's not this stuff over here because you've got a big boundary in between, which prevents the CUI from flowing over, right? It prevents this computer from making a connection to the CUI. Now, the antivirus server, this is a case where the antivirus server could be considered to be in multiple asset categories. Because when you look at the technical parts of this, an antivirus server has access to all the things that it manages, right? Antivirus servers actually have like super access to all that stuff. So because the antivirus server has this level of access over here to everything, you could make the argument this thing could, but is not intended to process CUI. Okay, so that's a case where even though we've got a big boundary in between, you might break that boundary by having access through it. Okay.
So that's also a security protection asset, right?
Yeah, it would count. It would count as two assets: a security protection asset and a CRMA.
Yeah.
And when assessors combine the two, we're going to say, okay, we have to assess security requirements that are relevant to the capabilities provided. We have to assess whether that antivirus server is doing antivirus stuff. Do we need to assess the other requirements? Is it well documented? Does SSP say that the antivirus server has MFA and screen lock and is being patched and vulnerability scanned and all that stuff? And then we're good. We don't have to look at anything else. We just need to make sure that it's doing the antivirus stuff. Okay. But yeah, this is absolutely an example of where we have to kind of combine categories, right? And again, this is kind of a new thinking since the final rule came out, where, you know, I'm talking to other assessors from other organizations about how they're handling this. And that's kind of the approach that everybody is taking. It might be that the DoD will clarify, right? They'll say, no, just pick one, right? And don't combine it. But right now, this makes the most sense to us, okay? But again, remember, assessors are only going to do this third column. We're not going to go digging unless this third column is a problem. This HR laptop, if it does not have the ability to go through the firewall to open up ports to the CUI laptop, then it would be out of scope. It would not be CRMA, it's out of scope. However, you know, over here on this side of the diagram, all of these devices can talk to each other, right? It's a local area network. And unless you've got a really strong software firewall around this laptop, you have to assume that these do have the ability to do it. Okay. Last thing that always comes up with CRMA is our customer, right? So what we hear from defense contractors is our customer sends CUI to the wrong place. They don't ask, they just email CUI to us. What are we supposed to do, right? So this is supposed to be a no CUI zone, but the customer just emailed us CUI, and now this computer is infected with CUI. Okay. A reasonable assessor is not going to immediately hear that and go, okay, well, it's a CUI asset, I'm going to assess everything. What they're going to do is they're going to say, well, what do you do when they email you CUI? When this thing gets CUI on it, what do? Do you leave it there? Or do you get rid of it? Do you sanitize the device? And if you can talk to, oh yeah, we report it to our IT department, we go through an incident process, you know, we remove it from the device, which doesn't need to be an extreme sanitization event. Okay. There is some slack there. And we do like to hear, and we also contacted the person who sent it to the wrong place and said, please don't do that. Please send it over here instead. Right? Which may or may not work. I understand. If you can talk to that, how you responded to this as an incident, and you took the CUI off, then this remains a contractor risk managed asset. Okay. But if you say, well, actually, we purposefully had CUI on there. We needed CUI on there to do the job. Right. Then that makes it a CUI asset. Another thing that will happen is some companies will say this asset. So, okay, so let me talk about something that's real bad. Okay, so some companies will not have a secure enclave at all. They'll just have their main corporate network, right, which is not secure at all. It's got tons of computers and stuff on it. And what they will do is they will say, we tell the customer to send us CUI to this location, right? Or we download the CUI from a file share or something. And we work on the CUI, and then we delete it off the computer afterwards. And therefore, we don't need to do any security on this computer because we have it cleared of CUI 95% of the time. That's not going to work with your assessor. Okay, if they're a good assessor, they're not going to be cool with that because you purposefully designed your system to put CUI on that computer. And while the CUI is there, even if it's only there for 5 seconds, that computer needs to be fully secured to level 2, right? Because it was a purposeful, necessary for functionality situation. And that makes it a CUI asset.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it is a CUI asset. You're just trying to kind of play semantics games.
Yeah.
If you try to do something like that.
Don't look at it right now. Look at it all the rest of the times, and that's not cool.
And I was going to ask you, so when you're like back to the example of the HR laptop, So if you receive it in error, having a policy that shows here's what happens if CUI comes into the wrong machine. We delete it out of email, including out of the trash. We
Yep.
remove the temp file. Like if we say these are the things we're doing, the assessor's likely not going to go look at all of that. What the assessor says is like, they know, here's what they need to do with this stuff to not to keep that laptop out of the CUI asset scope.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. I love it when a company can show me that they started an incident and they assigned a ticket to somebody to go and sanitize the computer and follow up, right? That's, to me, that's not evidence that you did it wrong. It's evidence that you did it right.
Right. Exactly.
And that would retain its status as a CRMA asset. All right. Last thing about CRMA is clouds. So very common. You'll have clouds which are CRMA. Actually, you know what? Never mind. In almost all cases, clouds are either CUI assets or security protection assets or out of scope. Okay. And because that's the reason why is because when something is a cloud system, assuming that it's a software as a service type of cloud, it's not something that you built completely yourself. There's going to be a big firewall in between that cloud and your network, right? Because the cloud needs to protect itself from the internet. Box.com needs to protect itself from the internet. Dropbox needs to protect itself. QuickBooks needs to protect itself. So these great big firewalls on the cloud do serve as a boundary, which helps separate your network and the cloud, and also your firewall helps separate all this, right? So because we've got big boundaries in place, if these clouds are not supposed to have CUI, and there's not some permanent connection between your network and the cloud, then we typically call the clouds out of scope. Now, a situation where it could be connected to your network is when you're doing something like an antivirus function, right? Where there's agents installed on the laptops or vulnerability scanning agent, right? And again, that gives you access, but it's not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI. Right. So that could be a case where these clouds would generally be a security protection asset, or else I'd be like, why are you connecting them to your network? Right? What are you doing? But that is kind of the thought process for CRMA versus security protection asset versus out of scope. Okay. All right, let's end it there. And next session will be specialized assets.